Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to share 3 stories that all demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to beautifully and meticulously detail the like button's car. But when you take possession of their car, just fill it with water and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Late at night on October 26, 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was sitting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio, when her phone rang. And the first thing she did when it rang was looked at the clock. It was 10:30 p.m. Like, this is not when people called her. And so worried something was wrong, she got up and she answered the phone and she said hello. And on the other end of the line, somebody said back, "Hey sis." And Ethel immediately knew who this was. It was not a sibling, despite the greeting, "Hey sis." It was someone that was very close with her and her husband, Dawn. In fact, this person who she was speaking to was Dawn's best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. And for decades, Lee and Ethel and Dawn had lived next to each other. They were neighbors. And basically every day, they were at each other's houses together. I mean, they were super duper close. But Lee had eventually moved to another town, and so they didn't see each other as much, but they did get together a fair amount. And also Lee very regularly would call the house and just check in. And so Ethel's thinking, okay, it's a little bit late, 10:30 at night, but it's Lee, so clearly he's just calling to check in. But before Ethel could really even respond to his greeting of, "Hey sis," because that's what he called her, sis, he just kept on talking. It was as if, Ethel wasn't even there. He was just sort of delivering a message. He was like, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like, I've never felt this way before. And, I really need your husband, Dawn, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then Lee hung up. And Ethel, after, the phone call died, she was really confused because one, it seemed like a sort of normal catch-up call, but he's saying something that sounded really serious, that, something's going on with him. But also two, what immediately stood out to her was, how did he know Dawn wasn't there at the moment? Like, he wasn't nearby. How could he have just guessed that Dawn wasn't home right now? Because Dawn wasn't. He was out. He was going to be home soon, but he was out at the time he said it. It was like he had this knowledge that he was gone. And so it just seemed odd that he knew that piece of information. And so because she was sort of confused by this call and worried about Lee, considering what he said, she tried calling him back. But Lee didn't answer. She tried several more times, never heard from Lee. And then eventually her husband, Don, he came home and she explained to him like, "Yeah, I got this weird call from Lee. He said, he wanted you to get in touch with him as soon as he came back because he's not feeling good or something. I don't really know." So Don's like, "All right, that's weird." So he tries calling Lee and Lee doesn't answer. And so at this point, Don, he's like, "Ethel, go over it again. Like, what exactly did he say? Like, did he sound scared? Did he sound confused? Like, what was he talking about?" And Ethel said, like, "I don't know. He just sort of stated that he just didn't feel good and he had never felt this way before and he just really wanted to talk to you, Dawn. But again, he mentioned you were out of the house. I don't know how he knew that. And he said to have you call when you came back. That's really what happened. I don't understand it either." And so because Ethel and Dawn really didn't know what to make of this, and just given the fact that maybe Lee could be in trouble, they were like, "You know what, let's just drive over to his house in the other town and just check on him. Just make sure he's okay." So they hop in the car, they drive to Lee's house, and Lee's not there. And so even though it was late at night, Ethel and Dawn really were worried about their friend, and so they began knocking on neighbors' doors to see if anybody knew where he was. But it would take a while, but eventually one of the neighbors said that Lee actually was at the hospital. And at this, Ethel and Dawn, it's like their worst fears are confirmed. Something really is wrong with their friend. And so they went to the nearest hospital, which is called Mercy Hospital. And when they got there, they learned that yes, Lee was admitted to the hospital. But unfortunately, he was dead. And this on its face was, of course, shocking news for Ethel and Dawn. I mean, they did not expect to find out that their friend of many decades was, abruptly and sort of inexplicably dead. But that was far from the most shocking thing they learned. When they spoke to the medical staff about what actually happened to Lee, they would eventually tell Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 p.m. the previous night. His actual time of death exactly coincided with the moment Ethel got that phone call from Lee, where he said to her, "I just don't feel right. I've never felt this way before. Please, when your husband Don gets home, have him call me." Ethel and Dawn have no way to prove this, but they believe that that phone call was actually Lee's spirit, his soul, trying to talk to his best friend one more time before he passed away. Thank you to DraftKings Sportsbook for sponsoring today's episode. I love to place bets during the playoffs. No matter the sport, the playoffs are just awesome. There's nothing like betting on a game when everything is on the line. Just makes it so much better. Do you love the thrill of live betting? Do you want to wager on the next big play or your favorite player's next move? Well, DraftKings has you covered. And there's even a special offer for new customers. Bet $5 and get paid in bonus bets if your bet wins. Minimum minus 500 odds required. Stay in on the action and use your bonus bets on DraftKings same-game parlays for a shot at an even bigger payout. And if for some reason sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't fret. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Pick 6 and have the shot to win cash prizes. New customers bet $5 and get extra bonus bets if your bet wins. Minimum minus 500 odds required. The crown is yours. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and sign up using promo code MrBallen. Again, that's promo code MrBallen. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma Qingmao and several of his family members walked out of their house in Luowan Village, which was a very small community in rural China. Luowan Village was known for being this beautiful, historic place, and as Qingmao and his family walked along, they passed by these beautiful, lush fields and saw these tall mountains off in the distance. But they also passed by something that made Qingmao and his family all very sad. The charred remains of dozens of burned out buildings were just littering the landscape. So Qingmao had lived in this village his whole life, and he remembered when it really was this happy, tight-knit community of over 100 people, and it really was just this picturesque place to live. But 3 years ago, that had all changed, and life in this village really became one disaster after another. There had been not one, but two enormous fires, which were caused by faulty wiring, but they had destroyed all these homes and businesses and all these historic buildings. I mean, it really kind of like changed the entire face of this town, and they still hadn't rebuilt it yet. But as bad as those fires were, it was actually what happened after the fires stopped burning that really, really made this place a nightmare on earth. And it was that for whatever reason, the mortality rate in this little village in China just spiked like mad. It was like all these people were just dropping dead out of nowhere. And it got to the point where the villagers were scared that like some illness was plaguing them, some unseen plague they didn't even know. And it got so bad, so many people were dying, that they brought in the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. They came in and actually did a full-blown investigation of this village. And they concluded that there is no connection between all these deaths. All these people that are dying in your village are dying from common illnesses or old age. Like, these are natural deaths. It's just this sort of anomalous spike in the mortality rate, and it's unfortunately, following this horrible tragedy, which were these fires. So it's basically like a tragic set of coincidences that these terrible things are befalling the village all at the same time. But a lot of people, including Qingmao, didn't buy that what was happening was natural. Instead, a lot of people began to think that their village was cursed. And so Qingmao and his family, they walked past all these burned out buildings and they made their way towards the center of the village where there was a temple, because there was going to be yet another funeral for another person in their village, a young woman who had died inexplicably, at least in the eyes of the villagers. It didn't make sense she had died, but apparently it's a natural cause according to the CDC, but they were going to another funeral. And so into the temple they went, and before long the procession began. Later that night, Qing Mao stumbled his way through the dark streets of the village towards his home. Following that funeral, Qing Mao and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for this big ceremonial dinner that was typical after these funerals. And Qing Mao's family, they had basically left pretty much right after the meal itself. But Qing Mao, he was feeling kind of down, like many people in the village, considering their sort of cursed status as they believed. He had stayed behind, and he had continued eating and drinking some alcohol and talking with his neighbors. Now he was finally on his way back home. But as he walked, he suddenly felt this really sharp pain in his gut, and it hurt so bad that it was making it really hard to walk. And so Qing Mao clutched his stomach and really had to force himself to keep moving one foot in front of the other. And then finally, when he got to his home, he opened up the front door, but the pain was so blinding that he just screamed out for help and then collapsed onto the ground right inside the house. And then Qing Mao, as he's laying on the ground, he began vomiting uncontrollably onto the floor. And then he just passed away right there, right in front of his whole family. Now, Qing Mao himself was not like a hugely influential person in this village. He'd been there his whole life, and everybody knew him, of course. But there was just something about his death that felt really monumental. It was like everybody in the village felt it, that when he died, for no apparent reason really, it just felt like enough is enough. There is no way these deaths that have ravaged our village are natural. It's not possible, and we will not take that as an answer any longer. And so the village director, who basically is like the mayor of the village, he wound up getting in touch with the provincial health department, and he told them what was going on and what the CDC had already communicated to them and how they didn't buy it. And so this health department, they sent out 20 experts to this village, and they did this big investigation to try to figure out, like, is there something causing all these deaths? Is it linked to the fires in some way? Like, what's going on in this village? And you know what they came up with? Well, turns out it's all natural. There's nothing wrong here. We believe what the CDC said. There's basically no issues whatsoever. You have nothing to worry about. And the village said, no. We still don't believe that. This is not acceptable. And so they went back to their village director and they said, you got to do something else because this is not acceptable. And he agreed. And so he actually got in touch with the police, just the local police, and said, hey, you come in, you investigate this. Try to see if there's something, anything that they have missed that could maybe explain why so many people are dying in this village. And so the police, they come into this village and they do this broad strokes, very wide sweeping investigation, and they do find something. And what they discover completely explains what's going on in this village. It would turn out the village's doctor, their one doctor, was this guy named Ma Foman. And Ma was not really a doctor. He had basically read a couple of medical books. That was the extent of his training. He was not a doctor. And so he's the guy they're going to whenever they have any medical issues, and he has no idea what he's doing. But he benefited from people getting sick because he's the town doctor. And so you have this guy who can't help you, pretending to help you, likely making it worse, who profits from illness in this village. So that's bad. But it gets worse. Ma was also the owner of the funeral home in this village, the one funeral home. So if his crock science, his crock medicine didn't save you, or if you didn't inexplicably get better basically on your own and you died, he also profited on you. So basically, Ma Foman had a monopoly on suffering in this village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money is if you lived. And for a while, Ma Foman just kind of allowed this setup to run as is. He didn't influence it at all. He just was a fake doctor and was the funeral director. But in time, he wanted more money, and so he began poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide, because then you have more people getting sick, makes more money, and more people dying, makes more money. But even that still wasn't enough for Ma Foman. He needed more death and suffering. And so those fires, that was not faulty wiring. That was just luck on Ma Fo Man's part that he wasn't caught. That was pure arson. He burned that place down, killing people in the process. Because again, he's got this monopoly on death and suffering in this village. And so in the end, the police who came in, they did this investigation and they discovered that those fires were actually arson, and it eventually led back to Ma Fo Man. In total, Ma Fo Man killed 76 people. All people that he lived with. These are like his friends and his family. These are his people. He killed 76 of them. And so he was ultimately convicted of murder and he was sentenced to death. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh sat at a dining room table inside of his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father to visit his aunt, whose name was Miss Blackwood, and also to visit his 19-year-old cousin, whose name was Madeline. Madeline was being looked after by Miss Blackwood because her parents had died 4 years ago, making her an orphan, and Miss Blackwood certainly had the means. She was very wealthy, and so she took Madeline in. And so basically that was her new de facto mother. And so Paul, his parents, and Madeline, they were all having this big, luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared for them, and they were waiting for Paul's aunt to wake up and come downstairs and join them. And this was not just like a formality because it was her house and they were, trying to be respectful. No, actually, they loved Miss Blackwood. I mean, Paul's aunt was awesome. She was super energetic and she was really fun. And of course, she was like very wealthy and her house was awesome. And so family generally loved to visit with Miss Blackwood. And so basically everybody's waiting for her to get up to start the day for real. But after a while, when Miss Blackwood had not come downstairs, the group just began eating their breakfast and just figured, maybe she's taking her time and we'll catch up with her, after breakfast or something. So everyone's eating their food and just chatting and having a nice morning, when suddenly the housemaid who had stepped away a few minutes earlier, she comes running into the kitchen. She's very upset and she just yells out that Miss Blackwood is dead. And for a second, Paul was totally confused because just the night before, his aunt had seemed completely normal and healthy. There were no signs that she had any health issues whatsoever. But the family followed the housemaid up to Miss Blackwood's bedroom, and they went inside, and sure enough, there was Paul's aunt laying in bed, cold to the touch. She was definitely dead. Later that morning, Paul and his very distraught family met with Miss Blackwood's regular doctor in the living room of her house. The doctor had just finished examining her body, and he said that, Miss Blackwood really didn't have any clear signs of illness or injury. But he said, she's 70 and she had suffered from heart disease for the last few years, and so very likely heart disease is what ultimately killed her. Now, for the most part, the family all reacted with a mix of obviously sadness, but also like, okay, that logically makes sense. And Paul himself, he felt the same way. He's like, that's really awful. I can't believe she's gone. It makes sense, but he also had this weird feeling that he couldn't quite describe, that just, he felt like something's off here. He couldn't articulate it, but he just immediately had this sense that that could not be the story, that something else happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything to his family. He felt like it was kind of inappropriate to immediately start, suggesting conspiracies about what could have happened to their aunt when, again, logically, it did make sense what the doctor was saying. And so Paul just kind of kept it to himself. But he didn't stop thinking about it. Once the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all just stay in Miss Blackwood's house. They had a funeral to plan, they had to deal with her will and her estate. I mean, there was all these things that were left to do. And the family had already decided they were going to come here and stay for a bit for a visit. So they'd already booked off this time. So the decision was they would just stay and try to sort of help get through this transition process. Fast forward 5 weeks, and Paul and his family are still staying in Miss Blackwood's house, largely because it was proving to be very difficult to sort of manage her estate. She was quite wealthy and going through her will and everything. It was just a huge mess. And so they were still there and they were still trying to figure things out. And by this point, Paul really didn't have a big role in any of that. He was just kind of there really to support his parents as they dealt with the estate. But Paul had kind of taken up his own mission secretly. He hadn't told people about his suspicions that something else must have killed his aunt. He didn't want to tell people that. He felt like he was kind of crazy for thinking it because he had no reason to think it other than a gut feeling. But he had begun sort of investigating. And his investigation had led him to begin sleeping in his aunt's bedroom because he had this belief that maybe his aunt's ghost would visit him in her bedroom and she would tell him or signal to him in some way what really happened to her. Now, for the past several days and weeks that he'd been in here, he had not seen his aunt's ghost. But he was not about to give up, at least not yet. So, on this particular night, this is again 5 weeks after his aunt has passed away, Paul is in his aunt's bedroom. He's in her bed and he's laying there and he's getting ready to fall to sleep. As he's laying there, he begins to hear a strange sound over to the side of the room. It sounded almost like scratching noises. And, the room is very dark. It's late at night. There's a window, but there's not much light coming in from the moon. It's just kind of dark in this room. And he opens his eyes and he rolls over and he looks over in the direction of this scratching sound. And he can't see anything at first. But then, as his eyes kind of adjust to the darkness, he realizes he sees something that he can't believe. I mean, even though in some ways he was hoping to see this, but he sees a hand, like a disembodied hand, actually a whole arm, is basically reaching out of the wall in his direction. And for Paul, he's obviously never seen anything like this before, and he should be terrified. I mean, he's basically seeing a ghost, but he's not scared. He's thinking, this is it. My plan is working. My aunt is signaling to me. She's gonna tell me in some way, shape, or form here what really happened to her. It's finally happening. And so with really no fear, Paul gets out of his bed, walks over to the disembodied arm reaching out of the wall, and he grabs it. After Paul grabbed the ghost arm, screams filled the whole house, woke everybody up. And Paul's father came running down the hall. He burst into the aunt's bedroom and he sees his son and he sees what his son is grabbing. And he really can't even begin to process it. It would turn out there really was an arm reaching through the wall. But it wasn't a ghost arm. It was not, Miss Blackwood's ghost coming back to tell Paul about what happened to her. But this arm did absolutely have something to do with what killed Miss Blackwood, because she did not die of heart disease. When Miss Blackwood was still alive, the person who lived in the room next to her, where they slept, they drilled a hole in the wall big enough for their arm to fit through, and they reached through that hole at night while Miss Blackwood was asleep, and they poured poison into the water she kept by her bedside. They poisoned her to death. And then after she died from being poisoned, it was determined that she had died from cardiac arrest, and pretty much everybody accepted that, except for Paul. The killer was aware, even though Paul was keeping it to himself, that he was on to something. He was sleeping in Miss Blackwood's bedroom. It seemed like he was trying to figure out if there was more to the story than what everybody else seemed to believe, which was heart disease. And when it seemed to the killer like Paul really was getting close to figuring something out, the killer waited for Paul to be in the same bed, and he had a water next to his bed as well. The killer reached through and tried to do the same thing to Paul that they had done to Miss Blackwood. They tried to pour poison into his drink to kill him. But Paul was looking for a ghost in the room. He heard the sound of the arm coming through, and he grabbed the arm thinking it's his aunt's arm, but he really actually was stopping the arm from putting poison in his drink, and the screams were the sound of the killer realizing they've been caught. And the killer was none other than Paul's own cousin, the 19-year-old Madeline. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood took her in like her own child. And because she adopted Madeline, she put Madeline on her will. She was going to inherit Miss Blackwood's wealth. And Madeline just couldn't stand waiting for Miss Blackwood to die in order to get that wealth. And so she decided she would kill her. After Madeline was caught, she quickly confessed to Paul and his parents that yes, she had done it. And so Paul and his parents sent for the police to come out here and arrest Madeline for murder and also attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could even get there, Madeline suddenly began bleeding heavily from her mouth, and then she collapsed and died. It's not clear what actually killed her, but it's entirely possible, if not likely, that she actually used the same poison she had used to kill her aunt on herself to avoid facing justice. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
So today's story is a very creepy one. In fact, it's so unsettling at times that you're very likely going to think it's just fake. But there was a pretty incredible discovery that was made in the early 1900s that very likely means this story is true. But before we get into that incredible campfire story, as you can see, I'm literally sitting by a campfire. And honestly, it was just because, what I sort of do is I tell scary campfire stories a lot of the times. But I never actually sit by a fire. And so we decided, why not literally make a campfire and tell a spooky story by it. And if this vibe is something you guys like, I'm more than happy to do more of these because this sort of breaks it up. It's cool. It sort of adds a new flavor to the channel. And so let us know if you enjoy this vibe and we'll do more. And I think that generally speaking, when we do literal campfire stories, I'm going to lean towards the stories that are of the spookier variety. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come to your campfire and cook some s'mores with you. But don't tell them you've secretly put firecrackers in their marshmallows. Okay, let's get into today's story. Hundreds of years ago, there was this young indigenous warrior who was on his way to the center of his village. And his village was located in this heavily forested rolling hills area of modern-day Richland County, Wisconsin. He was a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. It was this indigenous tribe, and that's where they called home. And as this young warrior, this strong, brave young man is walking towards the village center, he had been called there by his tribal chief. He sort of had an idea of why he was being called there. And sure enough, when he got to the village center and he sees his tribal chief, who's standing there with 9 of the other strongest and bravest men of the tribe, this warrior knew, his hunch was correct. So 2 days earlier, 3 teenage boys that were members of this tribe, they had gone out deer hunting in the wilds right outside of their village. Again, this is a heavily forested, beautiful rolling hills area. And these teenagers had not come back. They had just been gone now for 48 hours. And their respective families were worried. And they had been, telling the tribal chief that they really needed to send out a search party for them. But the chief had sort of held off, in part because it wasn't entirely uncommon for hunters, even young hunters, to go out for a couple of days at a time. But the family, they had a bad feeling about it. And so finally, the tribal chief relented 2 days in, and he was calling a search party together to go look for these young men. And so the warrior who's walked into the village center here, he was being asked by the tribal chief to lead this search party effort. He was going to be in charge of these 9 other men. And so, the warrior, in truth, he sort of felt like it was overkill to put together this huge search party for these teenagers that in his mind, he really did think they were just fine, but he didn't want to undermine the tribal chief. And so he said, of course, I'll go do it. And so the warrior, along with the 9 other, strong, brave members of the tribe, they gather up some weapons and some food and water because they didn't know how long the search was going to take. They said goodbye to the members of the village, and then they exited the village in the same direction that basically all the hunters would go when they would go on hunting expeditions. There was like sort of a well-worn path that led out into the wilds of the forest. And so the warrior, who's again leading this search party, he was a skilled hunter himself. And as he's walking along this well-worn trail, he quickly found the tracks of these teenage boys. So they identified the tracks. And, right away, the warrior's thinking, this is going to be, no big deal. We're going to follow these tracks. We're going to find the kids. They probably are out camping somewhere. We'll give them a stern talking to and bring them back home, and that'll be that. But, as they're following the tracks along the well-worn trail, eventually the tracks, they deviate and they leave the trail and they start kind of veering off into not really uncharted territory, but certainly areas that were not necessarily known for good hunting. This tribe they were prolific hunters, and so they knew this area extremely well, and they really had the designated areas that were the best. And so already they're seeing that these boys, they're doing something different, or they're doing something that's not advantageous for hunting. But either way, they're following these tracks that are going for miles and miles just into the wild. And also, as they're moving along here, they start to notice that there's no point at which the boys stopped. There's no, tracks that indicated they came to a stop and rested, or, stood still and tried to kill a deer or something. It was like they were just on a mission, hiking deep into the wilds. And so, the warrior's keeping a lot of these insights to himself, and he's just following the tracks. But after hours of this, when they still have not found the boys, they eventually found themselves at the top of this ravine. And as they're looking down into it, they realize that they've gone so far, not only away from their village, but so far off, the beaten paths that they were familiar with from all their hunting, that they knew this was an area that they really had never been to before, and they had no idea, what was down in the ravine or what was beyond. I mean, this is sort of uncharted territory for the warrior and the search party. But what they did know is that the tracks of these teenage boys continued down into this ravine, and so down the ravine they went. And then when they got to the bottom of this steep ravine, the trees kind of cleared out a little bit, and right in front of them, where the tracks continued, is this opening to a cave. And it's so dark inside that they really have no sense of how far back it goes or anything, but they see the tracks that they're following of the teenagers lead into that cave. But there are no tracks coming back out again. And so presumably the teenage boys, for reasons totally unknown, have hiked all the way out here, have gone into that cave, and that's where they are. But again, from the outside, the warrior and the others, they can't see these teenagers. And so naturally, the group, they walk up to the mouth of the cave, and even up close, it's starting to get a little bit dark outside, but there's still some daylight. Even up close, they can't see very far into the cave. It's just very dark. I mean, it's clearly big enough inside that you could walk for a great distance, or a pretty decent distance, but at some point it must sort of bend off and go in a different direction, and they can't see the teenagers inside of there. And so the warrior at this point, has a level of apprehension here, because he doesn't know this cave. He doesn't know this area. He doesn't know what's happened to these teenagers. He doesn't know if they're okay or not in there. He doesn't know if there's a predator or something inside of this cave. And so what he does is he decides, okay, I'm going to send 2 of my men of the search party in there to scout this out, and the rest of us will stay out here and just wait. And so he designates the 2 who say, okay, and they go into the cave. And so the warrior and the 7 other men that he's with are just standing outside of the cave, and they're listening intently, because these 2 men that are going in, they're calling out the names of the missing teenagers. They're yelling, and all they can hear from the outside is just the sound of the 2 men yelling. They're not hearing any response from the teenagers. It's just quiet inside of the cave. And again, from the warrior and the other search party members' perspective, they can only see the 2 men that have gone in for a little while, and then they kind of disappear into the darkness, but they can still kind of hear them. As they're calling out for the boys' names, they're calling and calling. And then around the same time that the warrior and the others he was with lost sight of the 2 men that went in looking for the boys, at the same time that they lost sight of them, they stopped making noise. It's like the cave went completely silent. And so for about 5 minutes or so, the warrior and the others, they're just kind of anxiously waiting, what's going on in there? But it's completely silent. 10 minutes goes by, and then 15, and it is dead silence. There's nothing coming out of the cave. It's just eerily quiet. And so the warrior at this point, he tells the others to stay put, and he just steps a little ways into the cave, just enough that, he was sort of inside the entrance of the cave. And he began calling out the name of the two men who went in. Now they're missing as well. He's calling their names out. As he's yelling their names, it's sort of echoing through what appears to be a vast cave system. But there's no response, at least not at first. If there had been no response, it would have told him at least, okay, maybe they're hurt or they're too far away, I can't hear them. But instead, he did get a sort of response, but he couldn't make any sense of it. He heard what sounded like a wailing sound coming from deep inside of this cave, way, way deep inside, this wail that at first it sounded like one voice, and then it sounded like multiple voices kind of layered on top of each other. And then, with this sudden realization, the warrior understood what he was hearing. It wasn't a cry. He was hearing a chant. And it was a very particular chant, very particular to the Ho-Chunk Nation. It was the chant that warriors did before they died. It was literally known as the death song. And as soon as the main warrior is hearing the death song being chanted deep inside of this cave, the other men he's with, these 7 others who know exactly what that song is, they all sprung forward and said, what do? We have to go in. There's something wrong. And before the lead warrior could tell them what to do, 6 of the other men just charged into the cave, chasing down their brothers because they believe they're about to die. They would never be singing that song, chanting that song, if they weren't in real danger. And so the lead warrior and the one other guy that stayed back, they stayed put, just kind of waiting to see what would happen. And they're listening to these 6 others, go running into the cave, and they disappear into the darkness, and they're yelling over and over again for their brothers. And they can still hear that chanting, that death song reverberating off the walls. But then suddenly the cave goes silent again. The chanting stops. All the calling from the 6 men that went in, that stopped too. It's silent again. And it's just the lead warrior still in the mouth of the cave next to the one guy. And now they're scared. And they're just listening for anything, but it's just completely quiet. And then, before the lead warrior or the other guy could do anything, that rhythmic chanting began again, the death song. But now it was clearly far more than just a couple of voices. It was this rhythmic, loud, multiple voices layered on top of each other deep inside of this cave, chanting the death song over and over again. At this point, the lead warrior and the other, he had a decision to make. Deep down, he knew it was his responsibility, his moral responsibility here. It was code to go in there, and if you have to, sacrifice yourself to get these guys out of there. But he also thought, logically, something bad is happening inside of this cave, and if me and the other go in there right now, we're not coming out again, and no one's going to know what happened. There will be no saving. Everyone's just going to perish. And so even though it sort of went against every fiber in his body, the lead warrior, as this death song is reverberating off the walls, he and the other, they turned and they ran miles and miles all the way back to their village. And by the time they got there, it was dark out, and they, breathlessly told the tribal chief what had happened. And he said, tomorrow, first thing in the morning, first light, we're going to go back to that cave and we're going to get those boys out of there. And so sure enough, the next morning at first light, the tribal chief, the lead warrior, and the other man that he was with, the 2 that had come running back from the cave, they, along with about 100 other members of this village, they banded together and out into the wild they went, retracing these steps all the way back to the cave. And when they got there, the cave was still, it was quiet, there was still light outside, but there was no sign that anybody had come back out of the cave. All the tracks that went into the cave still had not come back out again. So they believe at this point, still, their loved ones are in this cave. They don't know what's happened to them, but they're in there and they have to figure out what's going on. Now at this point, the lead warrior didn't really know what the plan was. I mean, he remembered what happened the day before, and really anybody who went into the cave was seemingly swallowed whole. And so he didn't really have a sense of how they were going to do this. But the tribal chief, he spoke up and he said, I have a plan. We're not gonna break up into groups and go into this cave onesie twosie and see what happens. We're gonna go as one big group. We're gonna lock hands in one big line so that we're always connected. Never let go of the person's hands that are left and right of you. And the lead warrior and the other man, they're going to lead us into the cave in the direction of where they heard their brothers when they went in there. And we're all going to trail, and as one, we're going to walk into this cave until we find our missing people, and we're going to get them out of there. And so the lead warrior thought this was actually a brilliant idea. We'll all be together. We'll be holding on to each other. Nothing can happen to us this way. And so the lead warrior was second in line. The man who was leading the line was basically the other guy he was with, the two that had run back. He was the other guy. So he's in front. The lead warrior is second. He's locked hands with this guy. And then behind him is basically about 100 other people, all, holding on to each other's hands, one big line. And when they were ready, the lead warrior and the man in front of him, they began moving into this cave. And so into the cave they went. And as they're walking, they can tell pretty quickly that the cave, it sort of turns to the right. You have to walk in, maybe 50 or so feet into the cave, but then it sharp rights. And so there's enough light coming in that you can basically walk all the way up to that turn. But then when the lead warrior and the man in front of him made that sharp right and they began walking that way, it was utterly pitch black. No light reached that section of the tunnel. But, they're leading the line, and so they're still just moving along, and the whole line's following them pretty slowly. And as they're walking, the lead warrior, it's like he kept trying to blink his eyes to just try to capture anything, but he can't see anything. It is pitch black, and he's just gripping onto the men in front and behind him as tight as he can to show solidarity, like we're here together, we're going to be okay. And as they're walking, the lead guy kept calling out the names of the many men at this point that were lost in this cave, but there's no response. And as they're walking and shuffling along, again, they can't see anything. The walls are getting tight. They hear from somewhere deep in the cave the death song. The chant begins low and slow, and it begins to build and gets louder and louder and louder. And at this point, because they're all locked together, you can't really get out very quickly. They're well into the cave at this point. They can't see anything, and it's like the walls are echoing, and it's booming in their chest, this chant that's only done when you're on the brink of death. And so as they're walking along, the lead warrior, he's trying to grip as hard as he can to the man in front and behind him, showing them, keep going, it's going to be okay. But then he felt the hand of the man in front of him, the line leader, go slack. And before he could grab it again, the man's hand was out of his. And he's reaching out in front of him, and he can't see him, but he can't feel him either. It was like he vanished. And so now the lead warrior, he's the front of the line. He has no idea what's going on. And he wants to just stop and turn and leave. It's getting so overwhelming. And he's about to do that, but he just feels like there's this force pulling him deeper into the cave. And then before he can do anything else, he opens his mouth and he begins to chant the death song. At the same time this is happening, deep inside of this cave, the tribal chief, along with a couple of others who had not joined the line, they were still outside of the cave. They've heard something going on in the cave, but it's dull. They can't really hear too much. There's something going on, but there's 100 people walking into the cave. They presumed there'd be noise. But suddenly, there was this obvious commotion, panic, erupting from deep inside of the cave. And before he knew it, all these people are coming running out of the cave, scared to death. They come bombing out of the cave. And at this point, the tribal chief knows something horrible's happened, and so he rounds everybody up. He does a head count and realizes over a dozen people are gone. They did not come back out again. And the cave that minutes ago was full of this death song and chaos and panic is silent once again. At this point, the tribal chief sort of designated that it must be the case that there's something evil inside of this cave. There's an evil spirit. There's something in this cave that is taking our people and they're vanishing. They're being swallowed whole by this cave. It's evil. And so from that moment, he forbid anyone from the tribe of ever stepping foot in this cave again. We cannot lose anyone else. Our best bet is to go back to the village and hope that these men, these brave warriors, eventually find their way out again. And so the tribal chief and the rest of these devastated villagers, back to the village they went. And over the next couple of days and weeks, no one came out of that cave. And as weeks turned into months, it's like the villagers, they couldn't really move on because they were not able to collect their loved ones' bodies or get any sort of closure. It's just this unbelievable mystery, this terrifying mystery that had ripped the entire tribe apart. And so eventually, after months and months had passed, and still no one has any idea what's happened, no one's come out of that cave, the tribal chief finally just said, we are going to basically board up the cave. We're going to cover it with rocks. Effectively, it is now a tomb, and that'll be that. No one will ever go back in. This cave will never claim another life. And so that's what they did. They used huge boulders, and they completely blocked the entrance, and that was it. Now, that was the story that the Ho-Chunk Nation passed down for generations about what happened to all those people, the warriors and the teenagers and all these people, that they were swallowed alive by this cave. And over many years, I mean, many members of this tribe, that heard the story, they didn't know what to make of it. Is it real? Is it just folklore? We don't know. But then in 1930, so hundreds of years later, a chilling discovery was made. So in 1930, there was this guy named Paul Seifert, who in Richland County, Wisconsin, he was sort of a well-known antique dealer. And something he really liked to do was he would go hiking in the forests of Richland County, the rolling hills, and he would look for indigenous artifacts that were left behind from, like the Ho-Chunk Nation and other indigenous tribes that were in the area. Sometimes he'd find, an arrowhead or something on the ground or pottery or whatever it was. But he liked hiking, he liked being out in nature, and this was something he would look for. And, if he found something good enough, he could sell it in his antique shop. And so he's out walking the hills of Richland County, and he's well off the trail. He's sort of out in the sticks, and he finds this ravine. And he walks down the ravine, and it comes to this clearing of sorts. And he notices on the other side of the ravine, the slope that goes back up, he saw what looked to be almost like a memorial or something, like a stack of rocks that looked sort of out of place. And there was like moss and grass that had sort of grown over it. But he immediately identified that there's a mound of something here that looks a little bit out of place. And so he walks over and he begins sort of pulling off some of the rocks. And he realizes pretty quickly that this was put here on purpose, this pile of rocks, these boulders and all this was put here on purpose. And so after pulling off enough of these rocks, he realizes that there is a cave on the other side. Now, it would take quite a bit of work to pull off enough rocks that he could actually get himself inside of this cave, but eventually he did. And once he was inside of this cave, the same cave the Ho-Chunk Nation had dealt with hundreds of years earlier, he's like, wow, like this cave, it's been blocked off. I wonder what's inside of here. Maybe there are incredible indigenous artifacts inside of here. And so feeling really motivated to explore this cave, he left, went back, got some basic supplies, including a lantern, and then he came back another day, because this is well off the beaten path. No one's going to stumble upon this. And into the cave he went. And so he's in this cave, and he walks, all the way to the end where it banks to the right. He turns, and he starts walking. And the ceiling of this cave begins to come down, and it's getting really tight on him, but he's so excited to see what's in here because he knows this has been blocked off on purpose. There's something in here. And so eventually the ceiling gets so low that he's crawling with this lantern. And right as he's thinking, this is so narrow, I don't know if I can fit, he pulls himself under this one really low section and everything just opens up. It's like this grand cathedral in the middle of this cave. And he holds out his light. He kind of stands up and he holds out his light. And it's just this massive, massive space. And right away, he sees something on the ground. There are all these neat rows of human skeletons. And they're all positioned the same way. It's like they're kneeling with their hands over their head, like they're bowing, all of them. You couldn't even count how many skeletons are all positioned here, right in the middle of this cavern. And so he's looking at all of these bodies and he's gasping, he can't believe it. And he brings the light sort of in the direction that all these bodies are aiming towards, all the bodies are praying towards. And carved into the rock is this enormous chair, like a throne. And there was nothing on the throne. And Paul, when he saw that and all these bodies and just the fact that he's deep inside of this cave, he was spooked. Even though there could have been a sea of artifacts he could have taken, he just turned and he bolted. He crawled out of there and he left the cave as fast as he could. And the reason we know about this story is because Paul, after this experience, he got in touch with a local newspaper. It's called the Milwaukee Journal. And he spoke to a journalist about what he saw. And they reported it. They reported that he found these skeletons in this throne, and it's inside of this cave that was blocked off. And, there's allusions to the story of the Ho-Chunk Nation. It's like this totally cryptic story. But in 1930, and even still today, we're left with a couple of distinct questions. One, what happened to all these people? And two, who or what was sitting on that throne?
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you two stories about people who basically unknowingly risked everything just to travel to their dream locations. And they didn't realize they were in danger until it was already too late. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please promise the like button a luxurious trip to Paris, but don't tell them you're sending them to Paris, Texas. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of Monday, January 7th, 1985, a 31-year-old man arrived at an international airport in order to board his flight to the United States. The man was very nervous. His heart was beating fast and his palms were sweating so much that he could barely hold the handles of his very heavy, tan-colored suitcase. And the reason he was so nervous is because he was feeling very conflicted about what he was about to do. On the one hand, this trip was something he'd been dreaming of for months, and it was supposed to represent the start of a great brand new life. Now, this man hadn't actually packed very many personal items to take with him. But one thing he had brought was a little bound book full of photographs, which showed what mattered the most to him. And what mattered the most was waiting for him in America. But on the other hand, the man was terrified, because before he could begin this brand new life, he had a huge problem he needed to take care of. And that problem was why he needed to drop off his very heavy suitcase without anybody looking inside of it. And so now, inside the airport, the very nervous man stopped and readjusted his grip on the suitcase handles, and then made his way over to the ticketing area, where he would check his bag for his almost 11-hour flight to California. And then, once he touched down and they landed in California, he could get off the plane, go to the baggage carousel, and get his luggage, and then everything would be fine. Now, of course, he knew this was a big gamble. If it had been possible, he would have just brought this bag with him on the plane to stow it in the overhead bin, but he just couldn't do it because the bag was too big, too heavy. And so really his only other choice, if he wanted the suitcase to make it to California, was to check it like he was doing, because the alternative was leaving it behind, and there was no way he was going to do that. He cared far too much about what was inside of this luggage. And so by the time the man actually got in line in the ticketing and baggage check area, he was so stressed out that he was beginning to feel physically ill. By the time he got to the front of the line, he still felt very sick, but he composed himself enough that he walked up to the counter of the airline he was traveling with, which was Lufthansa Airline, and the employee who was working behind the counter was very cheerful, and they greeted the man and took his passport to verify his information. Then the employee put down the passport and then reached out his hand and gestured for the nervous man to give him his very important suitcase. This was, of course, the moment the man had feared the most, when everything could really go astray. But as calm as he could, he lifted up the suitcase, and for a second he almost panicked because it was just so obviously heavy. He realized the employee might make him open it right there because it just seemed wrong that this suitcase was that heavy. And he knew if that happened, he was done for. He'd be arrested immediately. But instead, the employee just dragged the heavy suitcase over to a conveyor belt behind the counter, and the nervous man watched as the employee heaved the suitcase onto the belt, and the man kept his eyes locked on the suitcase as it rolled down the belt and then disappeared through a pair of rubber flaps at the very end. He was so focused on the bag, he almost didn't notice the airline employee returning to try to hand him his boarding pass for the plane. Finally, the employee literally just waved the ticket in the man's face to get his attention, and it kind of snapped him out of it, and he took the boarding pass, and as calmly as he could, he thanked the employee, and then he turned and hurried off to catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, another employee of Lufthansa Airlines walked around the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, which is typically just called LAX. It was about 2 p.m. Los Angeles time, and the employee was working in the international terminal. It was his job to monitor the circular carousels where passengers picked up their luggage after their flights, and his job was to make sure no bags were left behind. And as he was making one of these loops, he noticed there was a tan-colored suitcase with soft sides sitting all alone on one of the carousels. The employee stopped and checked the monitor above the carousel to see the last time this carousel had been used by an incoming plane, and it was quite a while ago, and all the passengers clearly had come through and picked up their luggage, except for this one lone bag. So, based on the timing, the employee figured that, well, this bag must be unclaimed. But this was not remotely concerning to him. I mean, luggage went unclaimed all the time. Sometimes because bags were sent to the wrong airport, or because the suitcase's owner missed their flight, or even just forgot to get it. But whatever the reason was, it was this employee's job to simply start the process of identifying the owner of the suitcase. So, like he always did, he walked over to the carousel and grabbed the suitcase handle and went to pick it up. But when he did, he let out a sort of surprised grunt and stumbled because the suitcase was so much heavier than he had expected. So he went back and he grabbed the handle with a better grip this time with 2 hands and braced himself and yanked, and the suitcase kind of toppled over and fell off the carousel onto the floor. And this was also around the time that the employee noticed that this really heavy suitcase had no tags on it. And so now this bag did seem very unusual. The extreme weight and no tags, that's not normal. So he knelt down and he began to unzip the suitcase to see what was inside. He was legally allowed to do this because unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search. But he had only unzipped it a little bit before he froze, and for a second he just stared in shock at what was inside of the suitcase. But then he immediately got to his feet, just left the bag there, and ran to go find a phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, around 3:45 p.m., Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in the baggage area of LAX's International Terminal, looking down grimly into the tan suitcase that was lying open on the floor. He was surrounded by officials from the LAPD, as well as the FBI, who had all been called to the airport because of what was found inside of the suitcase: the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was shocked. He guessed this woman was maybe less than 30 years old, and judging by her features and dark hair, he thought she could be from an Asian or Latin American country. But that was about as far as he could get, since she didn't have any identification with her, and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, so he couldn't immediately tell how she died. Ravens spent some time speaking to airline and airport employees, including Customs, which is the government agency that's in charge of inspecting bags that are coming in and out of the country. And he was puzzled as to how a suitcase with a body inside of it had somehow cleared customs. But an agent explained that they didn't actually open up all the suitcases, which meant whoever checked this bag through customs had taken a huge risk, because realistically, they could have been searched and then the body would have been found. So this suggested a certain level of desperation, but apparently this risk this person took to check the bag had paid off because the bag had gone all the way to California. But despite that, Ravens didn't find much to go on here. At this moment, the victim was a Jane Doe, which meant there was no identification for her, and Ravens knew she could really be from anywhere in the world, despite, his snap judgment that perhaps she was from an Asian or Latin American country. And because LAX was an international airport, whoever checked this bag and potentially even put her into the suitcase could now be anywhere in the world too. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators had finished examining the body as it was found inside of the suitcase, they didn't actually pull her body out. They sent the suitcase and her body to the coroner. Hopefully, an autopsy would turn up evidence that could tell Ravens and the other investigators who this Jane Doe was and what happened to her. The following day, on Tuesday, Ravens sat down at his desk and he opened up a manila folder he had been given. Inside of it was his Jane Doe's autopsy report. And when the detective began reading it, he couldn't help but feel sick, because what he was reading told him that this poor woman had died a horrible, torturous death. The report said the woman had bruises all over her body, like the kind you would get from repeated heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive, and her actual eventual cause of death was ultimately suffocation, which meant she either was suffocated and then put into the suitcase, or was in the suitcase, trapped inside of there, and suffocated. Ravens put down the report and leaned back in his chair and just sort of thought through what he had just learned. Based on the autopsy, he now knew this poor woman had died a brutal, awful death, but the coroner had not found any identifying information or anything on her that would give away or help to give away who she actually was or who did this to her. So really he had very little here other than knowing this lady suffered. Ravens had spent the last 24 hours poring over all the surveillance footage from the airport security cameras, looking for any suspicious passengers leaving without any luggage. But nothing had jumped out at him. He'd also interviewed a bunch of airport employees who would have been in the baggage claim area on the day the body was found, but none of them had noticed anything strange either. And so, despite it only having been one day since this woman was found, Ravens was already worried that this case was going to go cold. But what Ravens had not counted on was the huge amount of publicity his Jane Doe would generate. The TV news, as well as the newspapers, were reporting feverishly on the body that was found in the LAX suitcase. And by Wednesday, so 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had made it all the way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinoza contacted authorities to report that the body might actually belong to his wife. Officials in Peru called the LAPD, and Juan's report ended up on Ravens' desk. Ravens opened up that report and began reading. Juan and his wife lived in Peru's capital city of Lima, but his wife had been trying to leave Peru to escape poverty. She had left their home hoping to basically sneak into the United States so she could get a job there and then send money back to her family in Peru. She had promised Juan that she would contact him when she arrived in America, but after she left, Juan said he never heard from her. This report felt like a promising lead to Ravens. Juan and his wife checked a lot of boxes, especially because, Ravens' Jane Doe had features that indicated she could be from a South American country like Peru. And so Ravens wondered if Juan's wife had tried to get into America by using a human smuggler, which is someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally. Human smuggling was obviously an unregulated industry, and Ravens knew smugglers could be very violent or reckless, and the people they were transporting often had no protection. Meaning, sometimes when people would go to these smugglers to try to get help to go to these other countries, sometimes the smuggler wouldn't help them. They would just rob them, or in some cases, rob them and then kill them and dispose of their body. And unfortunately, again, because there's no regulation or oversight, a lot of times these horrible crimes would just go unnoticed. And so maybe, if that's what had happened to Ravens' Jane Doe, it would explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. The smuggler who, committed this crime would not have wanted to leave any ID on or around the body that could be traced back to them. And so Ravens picked up his phone to call the LAX airport operations manager to see if he could get the logs for any flights coming from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. And that was when he discovered there was a big problem with this theory, because there were no flights from Peru. The only flights that day that used the luggage carousel where the body was found were from Korea, Japan, and Germany. And there weren't any flights that originated in Peru that had layovers in those countries either, which meant it just wasn't possible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And so now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no evidence to go on. All he really had was the suitcase and the body. And the actual crime scene itself was maybe somewhere in Korea or Japan or Germany. And so Ravens really didn't have a good idea of where he should begin looking for more evidence. But then he got an idea. Detective Ravens got up from his desk and headed straight to the evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable gloves and he found the box that contained evidence from Jane Doe's case, and he opened it up. And there really wasn't much. All that was in there were pieces of jewelry and some clothing that were found on the woman's body. And all of it had already been examined for trace evidence like blood or hair. However, blood and hair were not what Ravens was looking for. One at a time, he lifted out each of the sealed plastic bags that contained Jane Doe's belongings until he got to her blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and he turned it over in his hands and then checked inside the neckband. And there he found exactly what he was looking for. Immediately, he felt a rush of adrenaline. He was onto something here. And so he reached back into the box and he grabbed another plastic bag with a pair of gray pants in it. And he did the same thing. He looked at the waistband. Then he opened a third bag and he checked inside of her blouse. And each time, his hunch had been right. Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them. And the labels were clearly written in some language that was not English. Ravens wasn't sure, but to him, he thought maybe the letters looked Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of Jane Doe's clothing. All of it had been made in the Middle East, in Iran. This meant that finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. But he also had another problem now. Really, he had the same problem he'd had when he thought his victim was from Peru. And that was that there were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on. And none of them originated in Iran. And there were no connecting flights from Iran that day either. And so Ravens needed the public's help. On Thursday, so 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down with a reporter from the city's newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that's read all over the world. And Raven and this other detective's goal was, to give as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that somebody somewhere would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward. However, that's not really how the interview played out. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged by all the questions he and his partner just couldn't answer. In fact, the last thing he said to the reporter, which ended up getting printed as the sort of last line of the story, the lasting impression, if you will, was, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office and had barely taken off his coat when his phone rang. A police officer from Sacramento, California was on the other line, and he sounded all worked up. He told Ravens that he knew that, the LA investigators had been working on the airport Jane Doe case, and even though it wasn't going anywhere, he knew it was a big deal for them. But he told Ravens that he actually had this unbelievable development in Northern California that was connected to the airport Jane Doe case. He said authorities in Northern California had just found another body. But when Ravens heard this, his first reaction was not excitement that there was new evidence or something. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He needed to find his Jane Doe's name. And so he asked the Sacramento officer, what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase or something? But the Sacramento officer said no. The body belonged to a man, and this guy's name had never even been on police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound, 400 miles away from Raven's Jane Doe, but the officer said that the story they had uncovered behind this new body would likely solve Raven's Jane Doe case. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Ravens. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been found at LAX, a man named Hadi had picked up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi, at the Sacramento airport, which is about 400 miles north of LAX. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who'd been away for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Mahmoud was always very optimistic and fun to be around. But on this day, when Mahmoud got in his car, Hadi immediately noticed that his friend seemed sullen and quiet and just very clearly upset about something. And so Hadi asked him what was wrong. And Mahmoud just said, "Oh, I'm sick with the flu." But to Hadi, Mahmoud did not look very sick. He looked worried and kind of jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive, he kept looking out the windows and out the back of the car, like he was nervous about somebody following them or something. And when they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to bed. And for the next 2 days, Mahmoud continued acting increasingly weird and paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment and said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He also kept looking out the windows of their apartment, but whenever Hadi asked what was wrong, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, so now 3 days after Hadi picked Mahmoud up from the airport, Hadi woke up to the sound of the front door of his apartment opening and then shutting. So it felt way too early for Hadi or Mahmoud to be up, and they also lived in a city where break-ins were unfortunately not uncommon. So the sound of the door opening was enough for Hadi to get out of bed and go make sure everything was okay. But when he got to the door, he did not find an intruder or something. he found Mahmoud in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend, where are you going? But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was simply going out. And so there was really nothing Hadi could do. He couldn't stop Mahmoud from going out, so he watched his friend leave, and then Hadi went back to bed. But as he was in bed, he had this sick feeling in his stomach that something bad was about to happen. About 2 hours later, somebody called the Sacramento Police Department to report finding a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a parking lot. The dead man had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and on the passenger seat next to the body were 2 Iranian passports and 1 Lufthansa Airlines plane ticket. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens the story, he said he believed that one of the passports that were found in the car with the body belonged to Ravens' Jane Doe. He said he would send it over that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive ID. And when the passport did arrive, Ravens was able to finally give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud's apartment, they would find another piece of evidence that would actually explain why Katan Safawi had ended up beaten and pummeled and asphyxiated to death in an abandoned tan suitcase in LAX. The evidence was a little bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on January 7th, 1985, Mahmoud very nervously dropped off the tan suitcase that contained Katan at the international airport and then boarded a Lufthansa flight to LAX. He was traveling from Frankfurt, Germany, one of the 3 cities that had flights into LAX that day that specifically used the carousel where the body was found. But Mahmoud's trip had not started in Frankfurt. It had started in Iran. But his travel plans had gotten all messed up, and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days. And so this was him finally getting out. But he was insanely nervous about this leg of the trip because of what was in his suitcase. He had expected to feel much less worried once he had successfully checked the suitcase and got his ticket and boarded his flight. But when he did all that, and when his plane took off, Mahmoud only got more and more anxious. Every time the plane hit even the tiniest amount of turbulence, he wanted to scream from the anxiety. But finally, the flight landed at LAX, and as soon as it touched down, Mahmoud got off as fast as he could and practically sprinted to the baggage carousel where he would pick up his suitcase and then board another flight to Sacramento. But when he got to baggage claim and he picked up his suitcase, he knew immediately something was wrong. With a shaking hand, he unzipped the suitcase, and when he looked inside, he felt a wave of grief and horror that was so powerful he almost fainted right there. Because the trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, that he was returning home from now, was a journey to his home country of Iran to get married to the woman he loved, Katan. And now, inside the suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife, Katan, who Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle into America to start their new life together. Katan had run into issues with her visa in Frankfurt, and officials wouldn't let her board the plane to America. And so Katan and Mahmoud tried for days to fix this problem, but it became clear that only Mahmoud would be able to actually enter the United States, not Katan. And so ultimately, Katan willingly got into that suitcase. Mahmoud had not murdered her, or at least not intentionally so. She hadn't been trafficked or anything. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that they would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane, and that's how they would get her to the United States. But during the flight, when she had boarded, she had been totally alive. But when she was in the cargo hold, other luggage had fallen and piled on top of her and slowly crushed her to death. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened up the suitcase and saw what had happened, he panicked. He pulled the tags off the suitcase and left the suitcase and just got on his flight to Sacramento. And then once he landed there, he was so overcome with guilt and grief that 3 days later, he took his own life. When police searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip to America. And those photos were of his and Katan's wedding. The following week, Mahmoud and Katan's bodies were sent back to Iran via the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles. But this time, they traveled together. On the morning of December 11th, 1960, a 27-year-old man named Leonid Rogozov stood on the deck of a Soviet ship that was sailing across a freezing ocean at the very bottom of the world. Up ahead, finally, he could see the enormous, desolate white landmass of Antarctica, a continent that was too brutally cold for human civilization to last at scale. Basically, nobody lived there except for like a handful of scientists and other people who were researching the area, like Leonid. Antarctica was about to be Leonid's home for the next year and a half. And Leonid, he looked around him on the deck of the ship at the other 11 men who made up his team, and he smiled. They were all part of what was called the 6th Soviet Antarctic Expedition, and they'd been sailing for 36 days, all the way from Leningrad, Russia, to get here. Their job was to get to Antarctica, disembark, and then travel nearly 50 miles inland over brutal terrain, where they would eventually build a brand new scientific research facility from the ground up, and then they would stay there and begin studying the local climate. Leonid and the rest of the men had been chosen for this expedition because they all had specific skills that the team needed. Leonid was a meteorologist and also knew how to drive this special all-terrain vehicle that they'd brought on the ship. There were a few other meteorologists on the team, as well as several engineers and other scientists, and also one of the men was a doctor. Their work was part of a larger Cold War-era effort by the Soviet government to expand scientific research and knowledge. So Leonid saw this job both as a way of having this big adventure and also as a way of serving his country. And so he ultimately felt proud to be here. But as he was actually looking at the vast emptiness of Antarctica right in front of him for the first time, the reality of the situation they were in began to dawn on him. And he began to feel a jolt of fear. Everything on this expedition had to go exactly right, or he and the other men's lives would be in danger. I mean, this is not a safe place for people. They were arriving in a place with literally zero infrastructure, and they only had about 2 months before the polar winter was going to hit Antarctica, which meant they had to construct the entire research facility and make sure it was polar winter proof in those first 2 months, because that was their shelter. And just to make the stakes clear, if they didn't get it done in time, or if the structure was flawed in some way, they would almost certainly die. When the polar winter came, temperatures would drop as low as negative 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ocean would literally freeze solid. The closest help would be about 1,000 miles away and could take weeks or even months to arrive. And their only way to contact the outside world was with this long-range radio that was not always reliable. So essentially, Leonid and these 11 other men that made up this expedition, they were going to be completely isolated, with nobody to rely on except each other, until their scheduled pickup, which was in April of 1962. Again, a year and a half later. So now, when their ship docked on the coast of Antarctica, and the captain called out for everyone to start unloading the ship, Leonid hesitated. And so did some other men. I mean, this was it. This was the real start. But one at a time, they began grabbing their supplies and climbing down a ramp on the side of the ship. Leonid watched his fellow scientists step onto the snow, and as he did, he sort of shook off his own fear as a moment of weakness. Right now, he needed to be strong. And ultimately, I mean, Leonid was a very strong-willed person. He had been born in a remote village in eastern Siberia, so he knew he could handle the isolation and the extreme cold. He had already done that before. He was also the son of a World War II veteran who had died in combat. And his father had taught him to soldier on at all costs, even under the toughest circumstances. So right now, that's what Leonid did. He soldiered on. He took a deep breath of the ice-cold air, then grabbed his things, walked down the ramp, and stepped onto the snow with the others. And then once they had everything they had packed for the next 16 months off the ship, the crew on board the ship still wished all the men good luck, and then they lifted up the ramp. And then Leonid and the rest of the team watched as that ship began sailing away, leaving them all alone for the first time. At first, things at the new Antarctic Research Center went pretty well. Leonid and the team successfully built the entire research building in time before the polar winter, so when the worst weather came, they were able to hunker down inside and be safe. They'd also set up a whole bunch of atmospheric measurement tools that allowed them to study the Antarctic climate exactly as they wanted to. So by April, so 4 months after getting dropped off by that ship, and now only about a month or so into the 6-month-long polar winter, The men, for the most part, were really just trying to stay warm, conserve their supplies, and gather data. However, they hit their first real snag on the morning of April 29th. Leonid woke up in his bunk that day with a stomachache. When Leonid woke up, he had that pain in his stomach, but he felt nauseous and so weak that he could barely roll over inside of his bed. And this really concerned Leonid. Because getting a stomachache back at home was one thing, but getting a stomachache in Antarctica was totally different. For one, there was a huge blizzard going on outside that was making both land and air travel literally impossible, which meant that even if Leonid radioed for help, nobody would be able to get to him for a very long time. And to make matters even worse, at their research station, they didn't have access to most of the regular medical treatments that would have been available back at home. Basically, if this stomachache was anything serious, Leonid could die. As a result, Leonid would basically not allow himself to even consider the possibility that this stomachache was serious. Instead, he told himself that, he must have just eaten something weird. They were all living off of rations of preserved food, and so he figured he must have gotten a bad batch of something, and maybe he just had a mild case of food poisoning. So he dragged himself out of bed and he went to the kitchen for a glass of water to hopefully settle his stomach. But when he got there, he saw two other men, another meteorologist and an engineer, who were sitting at a nearby table having breakfast, and they took one look at Leonid and immediately asked him, hey, are you okay? And Leonid didn't want to worry them because, again, any medical emergency is a huge deal here for everybody. So he quickly forced a smile and said, oh yeah, everything's fine. Then Leonid quickly grabbed his glass of water, chugged it down, and made his way back to his bunk. And when he got there, he didn't just climb back in bed. Instead, he grabbed some clean clothes and a towel, and then walked down the hallway to the shower stalls. And he turned one on as hot as it would go, and then got inside. However, before he could even wash his hair, his vision began to go blurry around the edges, and his ears began to ring. He felt like he was about to faint, and he quickly sat down on the floor of the shower so he wouldn't fall and hurt himself. And as he was sitting there with his head spinning and the hot water raining down on him, the dull, aching pain in his stomach suddenly sharpened. It was like a horrible, stabbing pain ripping through his stomach now. Leonid barely had time to wrap a towel around his waist and rush to a toilet before he began to vomit. A few minutes later, Leonid stumbled into a small storage closet where the research team kept a reserve of basic medications like pain relievers and antibiotics. Leonid took some antibiotics and tried to power through the day, but that pain in his abdomen just got more and more intense. Eventually, he told the other men on his team that he really had to stop, lie down, and rest, that something was wrong here, but maybe if he just lays down long enough, it'll go away. Leonid would spend the entire evening going back and forth from his bed to the toilet because he kept vomiting, and he didn't sleep at all that night. And by the next morning, April 30th, Leonid was in so much pain that he really couldn't even try to hide it anymore. He was still vomiting, he was still very dizzy to the point where he could barely stand up, and he could tell he was also running a very high fever. However, what really scared Leonid the most was what his belly actually looked like. He had not been able to keep any food down for the last 24 hours, so he knew his stomach was completely empty. And yet, he was so bloated that his belly was sticking out like a balloon. And so lying in bed, feeling feverish, nauseous, and dizzy, and looking down at his grotesquely swollen abdomen, Leonid had to admit to himself that this was definitely more than just food poisoning. Something was very wrong, and he needed help. The scientific research team's doctor took stock of all of Leonid's symptoms, and he immediately came up with a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was simple, but the treatment was not. Leonid definitely did not have food poisoning. He was in a life or death situation. This was a very serious thing. But to save him, the doctor was going to have to perform a surgery that had only ever been done successfully 2 times in all of history. And that was because this surgery required a very risky technique that most doctors refused to even try because it was so dangerous, both to the patient and also to the doctor. Basically, Leonid was likely going to die if the doctor attempted the surgery, but Leonid was definitely going to die if he didn't. And so ultimately, a decision was made that the doctor would give it his best try. At least that way, they were trying to save Leonid's life, even if they were unsuccessful. At 2 a.m. that night, so technically early morning on May 1st, the doctor took a deep breath and mentally prepared themselves for this surgery. Leonid was lying on a makeshift operating table inside the research center. He was wearing a surgical gown, and despite the fact he was about to undergo real surgery here, he was wide awake, because he had to be. Due to the nature of this incredibly risky and rare surgery, the doctor couldn't actually give Leonid any real anesthesia to knock him out. Leonid had to be wide awake and fully aware for this entire procedure, which meant all he could get were some local anesthetics, which sort of dulled the pain but did not get rid of it. The doctor looked over at the 4 other research team members who were in the operating room. There was a driver, a meteorologist, and 2 aerologists, which are scientists who study the Earth's atmosphere. Now, none of these 4 had any real medical training, but the doctor needed assistance to do this operation, so he'd recruited them to help him out. Leonid had his head propped up with pillows, and his knees were turned to the left, so he was twisted into a position where the lower right side of his abdomen was facing up towards the ceiling. The doctor had already cut a hole in his hospital gown, so Leonid's swollen stomach was visible. And now, through that hole, the doctor injected Novocaine, which is a type of local anesthetic, right into Leonid's abdomen. And then once the Novocaine took effect, the doctor used a scalpel to carefully make a 4-inch-long incision into Leonid's lower abdomen. Leonid took in a sharp breath, but he did his best to stay perfectly still. The incision began to bleed heavily, and one of the assistants came over and used a pair of metal tongs to spread open Leonid's skin and muscles and fat, revealing Leonid's internal organs. At this point, the doctor was so nervous that his hands began to shake, but he took a deep breath and slowly cut his way with the scalpel through the protective membrane that surrounded Leonid's organs. But as he did, he accidentally poked a hole in Leonid's large intestine, and Leonid noticed right away because he began gushing blood. And when the doctor realized what he'd done, he sort of began to panic, and he began yelling for the assistants to hand him his surgical sewing kit. And when they did, he kind of clumsily began trying to sew the hole shut. But by the time the doctor had finally closed up the wound, Leonid had already lost a lot of blood, and the real problem, the reason the doctor was doing this surgery in the first place, still had not been solved. Like, the surgery had not really even happened. We just had this incision, that's it. And so the doctor knew he really had to hurry before Leonid bled out, and so he threw his standard operating procedures out the window. He just had to go for it here. So he just took one of his hands and reached inside of Leonid's abdominal cavity and started literally feeling around, trying to find the source of Leonid's illness. But as he did, it was like all the blood drained out of Leonid's face. I mean, he's feeling this. This must have been horrific. His body went limp and his head kind of rolled back on his pillow. And this was actually the exact moment that this surgery truly became its most dangerous. Not just for Leonid, but for the doctor too. Right as Leonid's head rolled backwards, the doctor felt himself go weak, and suddenly he was seeing stars. And this was because Leonid and the doctor were actually the same person. In addition to being a meteorologist and a driver of that special vehicle, Leonid was also a recent medical school graduate, and he was the one doctor at this research station. So Leonid was performing surgery on himself. He had given himself that Novocaine shot, and then forced himself to stay still as he carved a 4-inch-long incision into his own abdomen, accidentally slicing into his intestines that he had the wherewithal to then stitch up as he's bleeding to death, and then he shoved his own hand into his abdominal cavity. But it was at that point that Leonid actually looked like he might die, because he began to show signs like he was going to pass out, likely from blood loss or just shock. But he'd given his assistants specific instruction on what to do if he passed out during the procedure. They were supposed to inject him with a specific drug mixture and then give him CPR until he woke up. But just as one of the assistants readied the needle to inject into Leonid because it did appear like he was about to pass out, Leonid suddenly sucked in a huge breath and his head snapped back up. Leonid, with his hand still inside of his abdomen, told his assistants that he was okay. Then he looked over at the mirror that one of his assistants had been holding up this whole time so that he could see what he was doing during the surgery. And with a combination of the mirror and just sort of feeling around inside of his own body, which must have been horrifically painful, Leonid finally found the thing that was making him so sick. It was his appendix. This entire time, Leonid had been suffering from acute appendicitis. Then he cleaned out his abdominal cavity with antibiotics and then sutured up the entire incision. When he was finally all done, Leonid examined his appendix that he had cut out of himself, and he saw there was this dark, diseased-looking spot right on the bottom of it. Leonid estimated that if he had not removed this thing, it very likely would have burst in less than 24 hours, and that definitely would have killed him. Within just 2 weeks, Leonid was back up on his feet and helping out at the research center like normal. And when the whole team went back home to the Soviet Union in April of 1962, so about a year after Leonid's self-surgery, he was greeted like a hero. The government actually gave him a medal called the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, which was for extraordinary contributions to Soviet society. And he would go down in history as the third person to ever perform a successful auto-appendectomy, and he did it outside of a real hospital with no other trained medical professionals anywhere nearby. And that's actually not the only way that Leonid's legacy lived on. Today, some countries actually require doctors who are stationed in Antarctica to undergo preventative appendectomies, just so that they will never be in a situation like Leonid. Because it turns out, the one thing you really can't bring to Antarctica is your appendix. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.